Good evening to everyone. My name is Professor Moira O'Brien and I have the pleasure of being the Dean of Science here at the University of Melbourne, and I'll stand back so I don't echo. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we have gathered on this evening. They are the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. I also acknowledge the traditional owners and First Nations people of the lands from which our online audience is joining us tonight. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are Australia's first scientists with deep and enduring knowledge of the lands, waters and skies. And I pay my respect to elders past and present, and I particularly welcome any First Nations people joining us here this evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first Science at Melbourne conversation for 2026, What Makes Cities Liveable? These discussions are some of my favourite events in our calendar as they provide opportunities to share our faculty's knowledge and love of science with the wider community. They allow us to explore the work of our extraordinary researchers on some of the most pressing issues of our time and highlight potential solutions. I'm also particularly delighted that we are hosting this conversation here at our Burnley campus in the beautiful and historic Burnley Gardens. The Horticulture Society of Victoria established the gardens in 1861 to promote botanical and horticultural science. It's now managed by the University of Melbourne, but the gardens have always been open to the public. And founded in 1891, Burnley campus is Australia's first school of horticulture. This year, we are celebrating 135 years, and I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about that in the months to come. Today, Burnley campus is internationally recognised for its teaching and research focused on urban greening, forestry, green infrastructure, garden design, people-plant interactions, ecology, biodiversity, and sustainability of cities in a changing climate. We will be hosting 3 more of these Science at Melbourne events at other venues this year, as well as a whole list of other free public events, so keep an eye out for those. Specifically, we will be holding our next Science at Melbourne event, which is entitled You Are What You Eat, That Gut Feeling, on the 20th of May at the Parkville campus. So again, keep an eye open for that in your inboxes. And if you have not done so already, I encourage you to sign up to our mailing list or keep an eye on our website to learn more about upcoming events so you can get to meet with us and we can hear about what you care about. I also encourage those attending in person to enjoy refreshments in the foyer, to talk further with our panellists and with each other when we conclude the formal proceedings. We are recording this event and will publish a video on the Faculty of Science website soon. And we will also email the link to everyone who is registered for this event. Feel free to share it. Tonight, our expert panel will explore whether we balance social, environmental and economic needs to create thriving, inclusive and resilient urban communities. I love my Melbourne community, but I wasn't always the chic urbanite you see before you. I grew up in country Victoria and only moved to Melbourne when I started my Bachelor of Science here at the University of Melbourne in 1985. And moving from the quiet open plains of the Mallee, which is from a town called Berrowillick, which had less than 100 people living in it, to the Big Smoke, as it was actually called, was a shock to my system. But as you can see, it was clearly a shock that I thrived in. Melbourne has followed the standard model of Australian city design since the end of World War II. From 1945 to 1985, it was shaped by the great Australian dream of owning a detached house on a quarter-acre suburban block, and it was ruled by the car. It had grown through expansion rather than density. It had expensive, centralised infrastructure for water, energy and waste. It had separated residential, industrial and commercial zones. Housing, schools, workplaces and shopping centres were disconnected, public transport was inadequate and people drove cars to go virtually everywhere. Streets were made for motor vehicles. Pedestrians and cycles were not welcome, or at least not sufficiently accommodated. Parking lots and freeways consumed large amounts of valuable land. Noise and air pollution were major problems. Space for nature and community was at risk. Now, the cynics among you may ask, what has changed since 1985? Melbourne is changing, thankfully and critically for the best. Time Out released their 50 best cities globally for this year last week, and Melbourne was crowned #1 globally as the best, most livable city. Now, this is the first time Australia has achieved the #1 ranking in the decade since this list has been ongoing. So Melbourne's previous highest ranking was second in 2016 and fourth in 2025. I'm trying not to sound gloaty here, but this year, Sydney came in at 21 and Adelaide was 29, which are quite good numbers. The survey on which Time Out bases these rankings include questions about residents' happiness, the affordability and quality of life, and the community feel. Melbourne's food, culture, arts, sports, parks and gardens were among the features that contributed to this top ranking. Around the world, many cities like Melbourne are embracing more sustainable models of growth and urban design that prioritises people and planetary health. And tonight, our panel of experts will explain some of the latest research informing these very welcome changes. They will also explore how we can accelerate positive change in our cities as a society and individually. Now, our panel will introduce themselves, so instead I'm going to focus on our moderator. Associate Professor Claire Farrell works in our School of Agriculture, Food and Ecosystem Sciences and is the campus director here at Burnley. She is a champion. Her research focus is on selecting diverse, beautiful and resilient plants to make cities more livable through urban greening. You will know some of her work. She collaborates closely with a range of state and local governments, landscape architects and other partners in urban greening policy and implementation. Claire led the Australian Research Council-funded Woody Meadows project, which continues to transform low-maintenance plantings in Australian cities for sustainability and low cost. She also currently leads the Arts Precinct plant trial, which is based here at Burnley, which are testing plants for the 18,000 square metre garden that will be installed in Melbourne's Arts Precinct. It will be spectacular. Now, with much anticipation for this important discussion, I hand over to Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Moira, for that generous introduction and for setting the scene about livability for our discussion tonight. It brings me great pleasure to be able to have the panel that we have together today, and I am going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and have what we're calling a visual biography of their research and their work to help illustrate what could be quite a dry topic without some nice pictures. So our first speaker today is Katrina Sedgwick, OAM, who is the Director and CEO of the Melbourne Arts Precinct Corporation, which not only manages the new Arts Precinct transformation, but also Fed Square. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you.
So I've got about 2 minutes, I think, and the Melbourne Arts Precinct Corporation is an invention by government that appeared on the scene in 2002 to be the kind of leading sort of point of accountability across an incredibly complex, stakeholder-heavy, multiple partner collaborative project that is the Melbourne Arts Precinct transformation that will result in the new NGV Fox Contemporary, which will be a magnificent new gallery focused on contemporary art and design. It's built directly behind, if we go to the next slide, it's built directly behind the NGV International. So you can see on the screen, we're looking at a sort of aerial view down on the work that we're going to do. So the large rectangle on the bottom left-hand side of the screen is NGV International, the theatres building, and then to the right at the bottom is Hamer Hall. Behind the NGV, the magnificent triangular building is going to be the NGV Fox Contemporary. And around it, you can see a whole lot of green pathways winding between garden beds with trees that extends the whole way, really from the moment you pass Hamer Hall, having crossed the bridge, the Prince's Bridge, taking you right through the precinct down to South Bank Boulevard. So we're in charge of working with the different partners, Arts Centre Melbourne, NGV, Development Victoria, Creative Victoria, to deliver not only this new gallery, but major upgrades to the theatres building and an 18,000 square metre garden that is extraordinary, and we'll talk about it in a bit more depth. It's called Lark Bundap, which is a Wurundjeri word meaning heavenly beauty. If we move to the next slide, another part of our work that I think is relevant is that as part of this sort of preparatory work that we're doing in terms of the research partnership with Burnley and with our designers, Hassel, So Ill, James Hitchmo, Nigel Dunnett and Jack Semler, in the garden, we've built a test garden out the back on top of the Fed Square car park. And there it is there. It's about a 60th of the size of what we're going to build, and that's been a fantastic literal test bed for activation and planting. If we move to the next slide, you'll see Fed Square. Oh, we've skipped to the next one. I think my Fed Square slide's disappeared, but we also run Fed Square, which is another really interesting platform. Oh, here we are. Another really interesting platform for civic gathering and activity and activation. Not a huge amount of green and shade in there, but we're working on that. And you can see from this vista how it connects to the rest of the precinct. So that's kind of what we do.
Yeah, it's wonderful, Katrina. And I think the great thing about having Katrina on this panel discussion is not only because of the visionary garden that Lark Bundap is going to be, but also what is this idea of livability? Is it about our cultural ideas, or is it about greening and other things that we tend to think about? Thanks, Katrina. Our next panellist is Professor Ilan Wiesel, who's a professor in urban geography, and to this conversation brings a bit of an urban lens with people and how we think about inclusivity. Thanks, Ilan.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. So exciting to see all of you here. So my work as an urban geographer, and I'd say maybe a social urban geographer, I'm really interested in how cities work, and I'm interested in the society, the different social, structures and the people that live in cities. I often look at it through the lens of housing, so I think housing is a major part of our urban systems, and you can see in those pictures of different homes, but really what I wanted to show you is also the spectrum, the socioeconomic spectrum, where we have people who are homeless. We have people living in mansions in Toorak, and we people have in public housing, in all sorts of different housing forms. And my work tries to understand what it does, that system of housing, what it does to our city, to our livability, and I'll talk a lot about relations today, so you'll hear me speaking about what it does to relations. If we move to the next slide, some of my work. Taylor, can you move to the next slide, please? Thanks. Not that one. Well, some of my work is I guess, looking at things like quantitative models, and I'm not a statistician, but I work with people who can do the stats a lot better than me. But we're trying to figure out, if you look at the distribution of income, for example, in Australia, and you can see a certain level of inequality, but then say we adjust it to what people actually pay on their housing costs, you see a very different pictures and much higher levels of inequality that are hidden in informal measures. So that's part of what I do. But I think, to me, the part that I'm most excited about in my own work is talking to people about their life in the city, what matters to them, a lot about their housing experiences, but through that is just a pathway to talk to them about other things that matter to them, and a lot of it is about the relationships they have. And a particular group of people that I'm interested in and that much of my work is about is people with disabilities. So I'll speak a little bit about that today.
Thank you, Ilan. And I think that's a very important part of this conversation also, this idea of equity and who we're designing cities for. Thank you, Ilan. Our third panellist is Dr. Marie Dade, who's a lecturer in urban greening here at the Burnley campus. And a lot of what Marie does is trying to quantify the numerous benefits that we can get from green space. Thanks, Marie.
Thanks, Claire, and thank you everyone for coming today. So I'm really interested in understanding what are all the different kinds of benefits that we get from different urban green spaces. So a green space can be any kind of vegetated space within a city, so a park like this one, or a verge, or someone's backyard. And these different green spaces can provide a multitude of different benefits. For example, our trees in our parks store carbon. They also help cool us and reduce temperature on those really hot days. They provide habitat for biodiversity in our cities. They also provide spaces for us to relax and reduce stress as well. And I'm really interested in understanding how can we design green spaces to provide a greater diversity of these benefits as possible, so that a greater number of people can come to these parks, and no matter what they need or what they desire from that park, they're able to get it. If we go to the next slide. Oh, no, that's not my slide, but that's okay.
Is that Ilan's?
So a lot of what I do is I model a lot of these different benefits we get across green spaces across cities. So I work out where are the green spaces across cities, what benefits are they providing, and also who lives around these green spaces are potentially getting those benefits. So if a park is providing a lot of kind of recreational benefits, who are the people that live around that park and are most likely going to be benefiting? And who are the people that are missing out? And how can we find ways to integrate more green space in our cities so that everyone has equitable access to green space and the benefits that these green spaces provide?
Wonderful, thanks, Marie. And I kind of wonder whether the livability rating for Melbourne is a bit of a result of us being locked down in COVID time and having to get to know our parks. But it'll be great to explore these ideas more. Our last panellist today is Dr. Mohammed Rahman, who's also a lecturer here at the Burnley campus. And like Marie, Mohammed's interests are in these multifaceted benefits we can get from green spaces, but he tends to focus on the things that have flows of water in and out, so cooling and stormwater and things like that. Thanks, Mohammed.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. Very happy to see you all here. So as Claire mentioned, I try to understand or quantify different benefits, as Marie was mentioning, that we get from vegetations, mostly trees around the cities. Can I have the first slide, please? Okay, so one of the biggest benefit that we get is the cooling, as you all know that. So I am relatively new here in Melbourne. I moved out of Munich in Germany, so you can see the slides. Yeah, what we are trying to understand that if we compare the city centers, which is usually very low in vegetation, in our case, for example, 5 kilometers away from the center, which has roughly around 40% of the greening, and then we showed that the extreme heat waves were almost halved. So you can understand the differences, how important at different scales, for example, cooling benefit. Can I move to the next one, please? Okay. All right, that's fine. Okay, all right. So, and not only like quantify these benefits, but also what types of trees are important, for example. So I work a lot with different types of properties of different tree species to understand which tree species is good at the moment and will be good in future, different climatic situations. And then I also worked with other benefits like air quality improvement, for example. So it will definitely improve if we have a lot of greening, improve the air quality, but I try to understand what the targeted intervention means to this air quality improvement. For example, why should we plant trees, or why should we plant which type of trees to have the to maximize these benefits. And at the end, I also try to understand the holistic approach, the comprehensive understanding of multifunctionality, for example, cooling, stormwater management, air quality, and what sort of intervention we need at a bigger scale, at the city scale. Yeah.
Thanks, Mohammed. And so for some of those metrics around urban greening or urban trees, what kind of benefits do we have, tangible numbers or tangible benefits from at the moment where we are now?
Yeah, very nice question. So as I mentioned, I try to understand, or I try to quantify the benefit. Just to give you some numbers, let's say the cooling benefits. So what we have shown that a single tree can cool as almost 3 degrees Celsius right at the center of the tree crown, even though at 1.5 meter from the ground, because it is a ready admixture of the hot air, it can be diluted up to 1 or 1.5 degrees Celsius. So from a single tree, and if we think about a big park, it can reduce air temperature up to 4 degrees Celsius compared to the outside of the park. So this is a big number, right? So, and then, for example, in terms of air quality improvement. So one study in Glasgow, they showed that, for example, increasing the green space amount from 4% to 8%, the annual average decrease in dust, or the particulate matter to say, was about, on an average, 2%. But in our research, what we showed, why targeted intervention is very important. If we plant trees close to the source of emission, like the streets, close to the streets, that can reduce almost 50% of those dust particles. And then, for example, in Western Australia, one study showed that, for example, compared to the pre-development stage, after the development, the flash flooding or the runoff increased from 1% to 40% due to all these built environment. And they reduced the transpiration, the water loss from the vegetation, to almost 1/3, from 450 millimeter to 150 millimeter. So these are the solid evidence base that we need for planning, that how important the trees are, what type of trees are important, what type of vegetations are important, and where should we plant them.
Yeah, and it's great to have those kind of numbers. It'd be nice if everyone moved on from a state of having to repeat it for every city in the world and believed each other. But Marie, how do you go about those benefits for people? How do we quantify some of those, what people get from walking in a park as an example?
Yeah, so this huge array of different benefits we get from green spaces. Some are easier to measure than others. So for example, urban cooling, we can look at reduction of temperature, like the numbers, quite easy for us to kind of interpret and understand that. But when we think about the emotional well-being benefits that people get from green spaces, it gets a lot trickier about how do we put a number on that? How do we quantify the amount of emotional well-being benefits a park potentially provides to a community or a group of people? And there's a lot of different ways that people are trying to work out how to do this. A lot of ways that we do it can be kind of before and after surveys. So you take people out to a green space. Well, before you take them out to the green space, I should say, you get them to fill out a survey about how they feel, what is their kind of mental well-being for that day, how stressed do they feel, how relaxed do they feel. And then you go for a walk in a park, and then they fill out the same survey afterwards. And you look at, see if there's a change in how that person has been feeling before and after they've visited that park. So that's often a way that we kind of try to quantify. And we often work in what we call Likert scale. So I'm sure you've filled out surveys before. It's like, how are you feeling today from a scale of 1 to 5? We often work like that in surveys to get kind of a bit of a quantification of how people are feeling. But the struggle comes down to the fact that everyone connects and feels different when they're in green spaces. One person can, experience a real reduction in stress when they're out in a green space, but another person might not actually change. Green space may not have much of an impact on them. And so it's such an individual kind of outcome, how green space affects people. There's no one way it affects people. Everyone has a different relationship with nature and being outside. Previous studies have shown that how much time people have spent outside in their childhood has a really big impact when they're an adult, and how much green space can help them regulate their emotions as an adult. With people who spent more time as a child outside, more likely to seek nature and seek green spaces as an adult as a way to unwind and relax. And we often call this people's connection to nature. So what their relationship to nature is, and people who have a very strong relationship to nature and green spaces tend to get more of these emotional well-being benefits than other people.
Yeah, and Katrina, how does that play at a civic scale? Like, say, well, Fed Square's a bit notorious for having no greenery, but how do you... That's not rude, everyone knows that. And it's changing, right?
within the heritage parameters.
That's right, it is tricky. And then that comes to an interesting point. So for you and for MAPCO, how do you reconcile these ideas with livability being associated with green space and those kind of things at a civic scale where cultural values come into play?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when we're talking about livability, social harmony plays a huge role in that, having opportunities for people to come together and be in a shared space, sharing experiences, sharing joy, sharing sadness, protesting together, grieving together, dancing together. All of those things are really important, and hard surfaces help us deliver those things in a more straightforward way. So Fed Square is really interesting. It's a kind of natural amphitheatre, and it works extremely well for a whole lot of the activation and activity that happens in there, and it's an incredibly important civic and cultural platform for the people of Victoria, whether they're sort of inner city residents, when we're talking about access and equity, or people who live in Greater Melbourne or across Victoria, to be able to kind of come together and experience, as I say, celebration, mourning, grief, artistic practice, whatever it is. So it's about finding that balance, and it's quite interesting. If you look at the arts precinct, it exists over kind of 70 years of evolution in a city that had a kind of a grid planned on one side of the river, and then a kind of more organic evolution. It was a sort of the industrial side of the river with South Bank previously. And over 70 years, government determined that we needed an arts precinct in the classic model and built the Roy Grounds vision of the original NGV building and the two arts centre buildings. Then there was, we need a town square. Where is it going to go? Decades of looking. Finally, it ended up where it did on the other side of the river with Fed Square, and now the sort of bringing in of this new additional building, but a whole lot of new public space, which is taking over underutilised public space, is covering up an existing roadway, Sturt Street, between City Road and South Bank Boulevard, has been kind of reclaimed for public space. And what is really unusual in this instance is that a government has come into the most densely populated suburb in Victoria and said, let's, rather than make that full of hard services for activation of mass crowds or commercial pop-ups or whatever it might be, let's put in that an exquisite biodiverse garden. I mean, it's astonishing, and that has come from government. And it's thrilling, so that the experience of public space, if you look at these two adjacent public spaces, Fed Square and then Lark Bundap, they are providing quite different functions, but always about gathering in free, accessible space for the people of Victoria and our visitors to meet and consider and think. And that thing about well-being, it's really interesting because, of course, there's those huge gardens on the other side of St Kilda Road, these kind of, the King's Domain and these kind of Victorian classic gardens. But what we have here is something that is remarkable and bold in its passion for biodiversity, constant evolution, kind of radical planning in terms of planting design for public space, like there was nothing like it anywhere, and as you can attest, as we're researching right here,
Yes.
right now. It's our version, I suppose, of meadow planting, but kind of ratcheted up in quite an intense way. And I think that provides a whole series of different functions. It sparks a whole lot of different conversations. It creates different inspiration. And the fact that it's entirely built on a deck in shallow substrate is another quite radical thing around urban intervention of scale. I mean, 18,000 square metres is about the size of the MCG, so it's big and it's radical. That will also be filled and activated with performative activation. It will have major artworks. We've commissioned 2 First Peoples artworks, one major one centrally by Wurundjeri people, who of course they are the traditional owners of that land, and also a whole lot of works from the NGV's amazing kind of contemporary collection of public art. But anyway, it is very unusual and it's very radical, and I think it reflects, if we go back to Melbourne being the best city in the whole world, I think part of that is Melbourne's kind of visitor attributes. Through Visit Vic, they talk about being a socially progressive place, a multicultural city, a 24-hour city, a place that is accessible and safe, and a green place. And that's kind of all caught up in this radical new investment and transformation.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, it's transformational. And I think listening to you too, Katrina, it picks up this idea of relational, doesn't it, Ilan? That Fed Square, the arts precinct, they're relational in their benefits. And could you speak a bit more to that theme and how you work in that space?
Yes, so I really liked your point about Fed Square being a place for connection and trying to build places for people to connect, whether through happy moments and grieving. And I think there are many studies in psychology and in other disciplines around, what is most important for people. And the answer almost always is people value relationships in their lives, interpersonal relationships, but you can also think about relationships people have with plants. If you think about green space, that's also relational. So if you think relationally is about how people think about relationships they have with other people, but also with plants, with their dog, with nature, with all sorts of things. So this is what we mean by relational. So I actually, if you just ask me as an individual what I think about those surveys, Melbourne being chosen as the world's best city, I totally agree. I love Melbourne. It's my favorite city. Can't imagine any other city I'd like to live in. But if you ask me, I guess, as an academic, and I'll bring my kind of critical lens there, I think we miss out some really important things in those surveys. And one of them is who we miss out. There's a lot of people for whom Melbourne is not the most livable city. And I'll show you one story that I think is a good example. And the question is the other dimension of it is what do we measure? It's not just how we measure it, but what is it that we measure? Is it sort of objective kind of quality of life? That's important. But there's also surveys that ask people about happiness. And there are very surprising cities that end up in the highest ranks in the happiness surveys, and are not necessarily the same places that kind of score high on objective quality of life. So I think relational thinking is somewhere in the middle. It's not just about individual happiness, but it's also not just about objective criteria of quality of life. It's trying to connect those two, which is what I like about relational thinking. Maria's story, we've done a study. This is in relation to who is not accounted for, whose voice doesn't really play into those. Melbourne is the world's best city. And Maria, she's a participant in a study that we did about how people survive. And this is literally about survival. People who receive income support, and we know that income support rates are just not enough to survive in the current costs of living, especially with housing. I don't know if you could read all the font there, but Maria is telling her story that she pays 90% of her income support on rent. That leaves her less than $50 for everything else, food, electricity, clothes, medicine. It's impossible to survive, literally. But she does survive, and she survives thanks to those relationships that she has through family that provides support, through her own, I guess, way of managing, her way to access all kinds of support services that exist, from a food bank to, I guess, different systems that provide her vouchers. She has to manage it really carefully, or going to having some kind of arrangement. She collects bottles for return and earn. She can make a few more dollars, and having help from her neighbors or from the local pub to get some of those bottles. So it's just a kind of story to illustrate, I guess, another voice, very different to maybe the ones interviewed by Time Out. But also I think there's the last photo there where Maria talked to us a lot about her garden. And this is the one thing that helps her move beyond just surviving the city and life in there, but she tends to her garden, and that is one moment of joy for her. So I think it connects to our story about green spaces and why it matters in a relational way.
Yeah, and look, it's really easy as sophisticated urbanites sitting in this room to be thinking how wonderful Melbourne is and the access to greenery and innovation and all of these things. But we do have a great divide, east-west, in Melbourne. And Mohammed, when we think about the West, what are some of the challenges that we have that aren't just about densification in getting urban greening to actually happen?
Yeah, so this is very important to understand that, as you mentioned about the West, Melbourne has a huge gradient of climate. So if we look at the West, the rainfall, annual rainfall is roughly around 400 to 500 milliliter compared to almost 1200 in the East and Dandenong range. So it's a huge gradient of rainfall. Temperature-wise, we have in West, I'm coming to that because we have the lowest canopy or the trees, a number of trees or canopy cover in the West. We have about sometimes 2 to 5 degrees Celsius difference between West and East. And in the West, the soil condition overall is very clayey, very muddy. So it becomes very waterlogged when it rains. And then when it is very dry, it cracks. So it's not very good for the vegetation itself. That is number one. So the climatic gradient is a big one. At the same time, in the West, we have much more built compared to the East, where you have this fertile soil and more vegetation. And in the West, it has a compounding impact with lower cover of vegetation. We have an increase of temperature, surface temperature, air temperature, and dry environment. So that's why we need kind of specific intervention to understand what type of trees will survive there, and then we also need to think a bit more of a canopy or a crown, tree crowns in the West. That should be the priority to counteract the future climatic conditions, to say.
Yeah, definitely. And Marie, on that, because I know a lot of your interest is in multifunctional green spaces, with lower densification, are there opportunities to do better out in the West or in the outer suburbs of our cities?
Yeah, so I think the outer suburbs of Melbourne versus the inner suburbs of Melbourne face two very different challenges when it comes to adding in green space and designing green space. And I think I've got a slide that has two satellite images of kind of outer Melbourne and inner Melbourne. And you can see I don't know what side of the audience is viewing this, but on one side we have some outer suburbs of Melbourne. You can see kind of very, very uniform. All the houses look very similar. There's some development going on where there's more housing developments happening in the bottom corner. And then we have on the other side an image, and this is taken from Brunswick. And in the Brunswick image, the green kind of outlined areas are public open space. So you can see in Brunswick, there's not a lot of public open space. There are a couple more green spaces that I think are managed by the council kind of littered in there, but they're really small in size. And you have a huge population density in Brunswick, a very small amount of green space to kind of provide opportunities or benefits to these people. So in the inner suburbs, one of the biggest struggles is space. Like, how do we find space for more vegetation, for more green space? And so we have to get really innovative about how we kind of add in or integrate green space, and that might be things like green roofs or, making more use of verges on the side of our roads and things like that. Whereas the outer suburbs, the biggest, they have the opportunity to start from scratch and to integrate their green space from the beginning of the housing, which is a fantastic opportunity because they can think as they're building these housing developments, okay, what benefits do people need? How do we design green spaces to provide those benefits? Areas for recreation, trees to help with urban cooling and carbon storage. But the biggest challenge, I think, with the outer suburbs is these developments are essentially, displacing biodiversity and displacing habitat for a lot of the species that we have around Melbourne. And so it's really important, particularly in these outer suburbs, and it is important in the inner suburbs as well, but in outer suburbs is how do we integrate biodiversity into these new housing developments to ensure that as Melbourne expands, because unfortunately Melbourne is going to continue expanding, we're a livable city, everyone wants to live here now, how do we kind of make sure that biodiversity is not losing out? In the West, where there's a lot of urban development happening, we also have a lot of critically threatened grasslands, which aren't found anywhere else in the world in terms of the species found with them. And so, but we're building developments over them. So how do we better integrate habitat for biodiversity in our green spaces in these areas, but do it in a way that doesn't trade off with the needs of people? So these green spaces in these outer suburbs need to provide multiple different things, habitat for biodiversity, but also, recreational benefits to people. They need to help with urban cooling, particularly if we're out in the West. And so we need to carefully think about how we plan these green spaces to provide all of these different benefits at the same time.
Yeah, and overlaying all those challenges of densification without probably proper planning, that's probably fair to say as well. Also public fact, not a rude. But Ilan, you also talk a lot about the socio-economic divide that's there as well. And so if we're thinking about quality green space and improving conditions in terms of temperature and all of those things, how do we also improve equity and the social dimension with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. How do we improve it? I think one way is to think about access to green space, not just in terms of the distance, but all sorts of other barriers to accessing, not just green space. I mean, in my work, I think about all the kinds of resources that the city has to offer, and who can access them is not just a matter of where one lives in the city, but questions if you have a disability, and then a lot of it is about physical accessibility, but also communication accessibility, having access to information about resources being available, whether it's green spaces or other. We know from our research that there's been a lot of feminist urban research that looked at questions of how women access and use green spaces, and the real issues there around safety and violence and fear of violence in public spaces. So that brings other dimensions. Part of it is to ensure we have a distribution as equitable as possible of green spaces across the city in a very spatial terms, but also that the other barriers to access green spaces and to use them are addressed. And it's not just about distance.
No, and I guess, Katrina, the arts precinct transformation and Larkbund Up will be transformational. Do you see a role for that impacting beyond inner Melbourne to how we might look at vegetation and diversity in other precincts and what people might demand?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think it's very interesting, the test, having the test garden literally on a pretty ugly car park at Fed Square, and the kind of change it has wrought in terms of the experience of that space and who's wandering by and discovering it. All the programs that we're running around it are free, so there's that kind of accessibility, but information, like access to information for people to even know that these things are happening. So we're doing a big greening master plan of Fed Square at the moment. You'll notice that there are some trees there, but there's not much else in terms of the main square, and we want to kind of green it and do all that kind of stuff. Use that as a platform to then proselytise about understory planting, likewise at the Test Garden, likewise ultimately at Bundup. It picks up on the work of sort of activists, people like Emma Cutting, who does the sort of, what's it called, Heartscapes. Who's a kind of crazy about pollinator corridors and planting in verges, and got nooks and crannies to get these plants in wherever we can. There's a whole lot of kind of inspiration that when you do these kind of events at scale, make them free, but then work out how you invite people to participate. And that's about spending subsidy in different ways. It's not about marketing through the Age, which has a very particular readership, but going out into different social networks, community groups, radio station influencers in the most kind of diverse sense of influencers and communities and different voices, sharing messages to encourage communities from across Greater Melbourne to come in. It is centralised, it does require travel, but you are operating in these places at scale with the benefit of a critical mass moment that is thrilling in terms of connection and relation, and that sense of a big part of a vast community that is a diverse community, and the benefits of all of that. Prioritising subsidy to speak to those people, spending the time to build that trust, to build those networks in order to then proselytise through interpretive materials, planting, beauty, to inspire people to then go, I'm actually going to plant this rare endemic native grass from Victoria in my garden that's going to help me attract the blue-banded bee, for example. All of those things kind of come together, and we have to think holistically about it. It's not just about planting, it's also about how do you activate, invite, interpret, connect, and that's about partnership, which is what everybody talks about but is actually very hard to realise, and that is across science, art, community, civics, etc., etc. Holistic approach, I think, is the...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a really interesting case study, the Test Garden, and if you haven't visited, I really encourage you to. I think it brings to mind that saying that people don't like what they don't know, and to demonstrate a diverse, dynamic, kind of crazy planting in the traditional sense. It's not how we normally plant gardens. It's not roses and it's not organised, and it's all of that. And I think, Marie, it speaks to this idea of if we want to put biodiversity in, how do we go around those trade-offs between what people perceive biodiversity to be with its benefits and getting people to do it where they are?
Yeah, so when we think about all the multiple benefits that green spaces can provide, we often find if you design a green space to provide more of a particular benefit, like recreation, for example, sometimes that can come at a trade-off or a cost to another benefit that can be provided by that green space. And often we have seen that there is a trade-off between recreation and biodiversity historically in urban green spaces, where when you increase the design of an urban green space to provide more recreation, like open space for sporting activities, lots of paths for people to walk and move around, lots of open space and good visibility for people cycling or running. That can come at a loss to providing good biodiversity habitat, because biodiversity habitat, particularly if we think about Australian biodiversity habitat, particularly here in Melbourne, It's, it doesn't make great picnicking area. There's some spiky plants. People probably don't want to sit on them. People sometimes in the past can be a bit nervous about having a lot of native vegetation in their parks because of the risk of snakes and other creepy crawlies that they're a bit nervous about. And also to provide good habitat for wildlife in our green spaces. You don't want a lot of paths or too many paths because that can increase trampling, it can increase disturbance for wildlife. And so you kind of juggle all these different things. But as our cities as populations grow in our cities and we're demanding more and more from our green spaces, more people want to use that green space as populations grow, we need to think carefully about how do we better balance things, particularly recreation and biodiversity, because our cities are expanding, and as they're expanding, we're potentially losing biodiversity habitat. People want more recreation from our green spaces, so we need to better manage what green space we have to provide these things. And I think there are some, preconceived perceptions or fears around biodiversity, like I talked about reptiles and snakes, which sometimes concern people. But, in the past, some people, when you do surveys, some people regard native vegetation as messy. They don't like the look of it. It's not clean and neat often. And also we find that people often, particularly a lot of people have fears around gum trees and eucalyptus trees. Particularly the really tall old ones, which are unfortunately the ones that are most important for biodiversity, because they fear branches falling, they fear the messiness of the nuts of the eucalypt trees, and there's this preconceived notion that eucalypt trees are more dangerous than other trees, of branches falling and things like that, which there's actually no real evidence for. But it's just one of those kind of preconceived kind of fears that people have. Like, we did workshops out in Werribee where we were talking to people, what kind of green space do you want on your streets? And the first thing that came out was, we don't want gum trees, no eucalypts. They cause damage, they have branches falling. And then we asked, well, you want more biodiversity in your street, but you don't want eucalypts. And eucalypts provide the most biodiversity, particularly for birds. We have an old honours student who's here today actually, who found that old eucalypt trees provide much more resources for birds than any other street tree in Melbourne. And so we actually had to talk with these workshop participants about okay, what are your fears around eucalypts? And most of it is just, they seem to think that they cause more damage, like more branches falling than other trees, but there's no evidence for that. And so trying to juggle these kind of preconceived, perceptions or fears that some of the community has around particularly some of our native vegetation or native wildlife like reptiles, I think is probably one of the biggest ways to move forward. And if you work with the community and you help educate and work with the community about biodiversity isn't scary, and we can better integrate it in our green spaces. And I think the other thing I'll mention on it is that there's a lot of advancing research these days about how to make native vegetation in our green spaces more, I want to say aesthetically pleasing, more beautiful, more flowers, more kind of people-friendly and recreationally friendly, Clare's Woody Meadows is a fantastic example of that, where you've designed these plantings of shrubs and woody plants in urban areas that provide beautiful flowers and are really aesthetically pleasing, and people love them, and it's all native vegetation. So I think it's trying to find new innovative ways to bring biodiversity in, as well as working with communities and helping to educate, but also work with them to kind of work through some of these preconceived concerns, can really help reduce these trade-offs, because I think a lot of the time there isn't actually much of a trade-off between biodiversity, recreation and green space. It's actually there's some very easy solutions to get around it. It just requires a lot of innovative thinking and also working a lot more with the community.
Yeah, it's true. Trees are really polarising, which is why I don't work on anything taller than me. That's a fun fact about me. But Mohammed, at the start of all of this, you listed a huge range of benefits that trees provide us. In your work and your experience, how have you gone to convince communities that might not want a certain tree outside the front of their house or in their street that it's a good idea and they should embrace it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important to involve the community, to talk with the people, because at the end of the day, we are doing this for the sake of people, right? So the betterment of the living places, so that people can enjoy them, their cities. So there are several ways, I think, to increase the awareness and to visualize the benefits that we really get. So in one of our experiments, what we tried, we named our project as the talking trees. So then all the different type of sensors, it's very sophisticated sensor instrumentations, and they send us data through radio signals, and we converted the data into more usable format. For example, we named one tree as Michael. So, so how Michael is doing today. So people can see, we visualize them, that how much water they are getting, how much water they are pumping out. If it is too dry, then Michael is not feeling very well. And then to see these displays, people need to drive, right? So how much Michael is sequestering or how much carbon they are producing to offset that the carbon you emit when you drive here. So it took almost like 1 year for Michael to absorb the carbon that has been emitted to drive a 5-kilometer road, something like that. So, but people were so interested and they got so involved into it that they started to get involved into those projects, and they were saying, oh yeah, that's fascinating. So one single tree can lose almost 100 liters of water, but we don't see them. So this is very important. And then this is also related to a medium-sized air cooler, for example, a single tree that we have shown. So people really got fascinated that, okay, we have shade and we can reduce the energy like 25%. So people got, oh wow, that is a monetary value involved in it. So we can think of it. We can plant trees in this direction, and we can plant trees which provide more shade to the buildings, to the people living there. We can save energy, we can save money, and then at the same time it increases your. For example, long ago in 1986, in Finland, one study showed that the patient in hospital who is looking over his window and there is a building wall outside, compared to a patient who is looking outside his window and looking for like 3-4 trees, the recovery rate is 5 times higher. So the importance. So we just have to convey this sort of message that it also brings not only energy savings or better for cooling effect, for example, but it also helps to giving you mental satisfaction, human well-being from physical and mental sources. And that at the end of the day, you can increase your property value, right? So there are a lot of studies which show that you can increase, that's why we have trees in our nature strips, right? This increases. Think about buying a new house without any trees. So the property prices are usually 20% lower. So think about in this direction. So we tried to convince people saying that, okay, don't just go for built for everything, whatever you got 500 square meter place, and just don't go for building everything there. Just think about some strips, some space left for the greenery. I think this is the way how we should think about convincing people to make people interested in urban greenery.
And Ilan, we have this, I guess, concept where, the experts in the room, we might all know how to do something and we think that's the way it should be done. But how do we go about inclusive decision-making processes?
Yeah, so so this shifts the conversation from what is the right trade-off to who decides in the end. And I guess in geography, in urban studies more broadly, we have this concept of the right to the city, which is not just the right to enjoy the city and to enjoy what the city has to offer, including green spaces and including everything else, and places like Fed Square and art precincts. So that's part of the right to the city, but probably a more profound part is who has the right to shape the city and to make the city what it is and what it can be in the future. And not obviously, like the right to the city is not equally distributed in anywhere really in the world, I think. But and there are some serious, I think, threats to our right to the city here, and the privatization of public spaces is one of them. So when the space is publicly owned and shared, then people like Katrina and yourself do quite a lot of work to engage communities to make decisions. Not always, but this is the best practice, and I think it's done quite well in Melbourne. But when space is privatized, owned by individuals or corporations, it doesn't happen, and we lose that right to the city. So I think part of it is fighting to keep spaces public and to keep them as commons so that we can have communities making decisions. I do think it's really important for the experts, like Marie was saying, and like Mohammed, to come in and talk to communities, because the right to the city doesn't just mean, oh yeah, well, we'll let the community decide without any information. It means providing people that information and the knowledge to make informed decisions. So the expert knowledge is really important, but also the political side of who can decide. And maybe just one point I'll add is if we extend that right to the city, and maybe that's a more radical idea, but it's not just for humans, but it is for those possums and for other beings that share our city. That's how we can start to think about biodiversity, and that they also have a right to exist with us in these cities. And they have a right to, in whatever animal or plant way they have, to express their preferences for life in the city, to acknowledge that and to include that in our designs. And I know that experts do that, and this is a big part of the work that Marie and Mohammed do, is to understand what nature needs, what kind of spaces are needed for them.
And that's a really good introduction to our last question, which will be for Katrina. And Katrina, you can choose how you would like to answer this and maybe manage my expectations. But for large-scale transformations, how do you manage stakeholder expectations and these trade-offs?
I mean, that's such a tricky question. I mean, and it depends on the stakeholder, of course, but let's talk about the public, because ultimately they are the owner of these spaces. And I think, you know, for something like the Melbourne Arts Precinct transformation or something like Fed Square, you know, there is an architectural competition and a vision comes in terms of the built form and the, you know, the garden design, the plant design, all of those sorts of things. And inevitably they're controversial because they're about aesthetic, subjective judgments that are made. But I think it comes down to purpose is the fundamental thing, and being very clear from the outset why you're doing this thing. What is its purpose? Why is government spending taxpayer dollars? It's not privatised, it is public, it is owned by the people. Why are they doing it? Being very clear about that and then championing that purpose through the process of delivery to make sure that that purpose doesn't disappear. Now, in the case of Fed Square, interestingly, before it went to competition, it had a civic and cultural charter clearly drawn out, which articulated what its foundational purpose was. And even though the building itself was very controversial, it became beloved very quickly because of the clarity of that sense of purpose. And interestingly enough, 15 years into its existence, when it was facing very real financial challenges, the decision was made to bring an Apple flagship store into the square. The people rose up and said, "This is our charter. this is the purpose, I'm sorry, that doesn't fit. So it's very interesting in terms of that sort of managing of expectation and having ambition about what that's going to be in the beginning. So in the current piece of work that we're doing, it is called the Melbourne Arts Precinct Transformation. That is a very big word. It's already a very large, heavily invested in precinct. When we talk about who gets the money, a lot of money has gone into that kind of space. More substantial money is going into it now, and it's going to transform it. Well, how and why? And there's very kind of, I think, clear purpose around, why we're building a gallery. I think there's clear purpose around why that public space is opening up and connecting across that heavily dense suburb, which is, not only incredibly dense, but incredibly culturally diverse area, full of young people, young professionals who are here, who moved to our city to work and live. What does it do to transform the livability of that? It's a place of study and learning, arts specialties, but there's a lot of young people, secondary and tertiary students learning there, and what is it going to do for their work? And how does it sort of sit there with a garden in the middle of it that is radical in its approach to planting, and how does that then radiate outwards, to go back to your earlier question, and genuinely influence and change conversation across the broader city? So I think it's about being clear about that purpose and managing stakeholders at a public level and putting in very high expectations about what they should get. And when we deliver it, there'll be all sorts of arguments and argy-bargy and controversy about all sorts of elements in it. It's not, the garden's not pretty in the way that I expected it to be, and I hate that building, But that sense of purpose will, I believe, win out, and it will become beloved, and it will become embedded, and it will be transformative in the same way that many other, something like Fed Square, which I think is a remarkably successful intervention in urban space. And we're going to help deal with the kind of greening challenges with that over time as well. I don't know if that really answers the question.
It does answer my question.
Good,
and
okay.
I think it ties everyone's thoughts together too, that clear purpose, direction, evidence, consultation, and taking people on the journey is really how we're going to have more livable cities going forward. We are now able to open up questions to the audience, but I think, Jo, you have been monitoring the online questions. Do we have one to start with for the panel?
Yes, hi Claire. We've got lots of people tuning in online tonight and questions coming through. The question with the most votes at the moment is from Stefan. Melbourne grows by about 100,000 people each year. Most of these move to the fringes in depressing suburbs. How do we improve the livability of these suburbs?
Wow. Who would like to go first?
I can start if you want.
Good work, Marie.
So how do we increase the livability of our depressing outer suburbs? I can't really speak on the design of the properties themselves. That's the developer's responsibility. But if we think about how we design green spaces in these areas, I think there's a lot that we can do to design green spaces that create a more vibrant, livable area. Like Katrina mentioned, like green spaces, open spaces, bring communities together. They bring life to our communities. They bring people together, and they help people develop these relationships with each other, but also with nature and their surroundings as well. So I think incorporating green space into these areas are really crucial to create a vibrant community. It's really important when you're designing green spaces in new areas and you've got this blank slate, to think about what do the people actually want from their green spaces, what do they need? And so that consultation, working out, there are a lot of young families here, do we need playgrounds? Do we need recreational areas? Do we need open space for social interactions? Like, what do the people want is crucial, because if a green space, like any space, isn't providing what people need or what they desire, no one's going to use it. it's not going to provide the benefits you want it to. And also, I guess, kind of bringing in that element of biodiversity as well. Previous studies I've done has found that the most well-used green spaces in cities are often these linear parks. So these might be those like strips along waterways, such as like the Merry Creek Reserve and the Merry Creek Trail. They're the most popular, often the most popular or well-used green spaces in our cities. And it's because so many people have easy accessibility to these long linear green space corridors, because someone who lives in the northern end can use it, but someone in the southern end can use it, whereas compact square green spaces, less people are kind of exposed to it as much, or not as many people live close to it, I guess, whereas a linear park, because it's got more edges, more people are kind of closer to it. And so these linear parks are really crucial for bringing people together and kind of increasing recreation as well. But yeah, I would say like more green spaces, but also making sure that they're designed in a way that they provide what the people need in those areas.
Mohammed,
Maybe I can add a little bit as well. So while Marie just left that about the design, so I think it's very important not only to think about that kind of species or type of trees or vegetation which will not only survive in the present day west condition, drier condition, but in 50 years time it will be even more drier. We are heading towards much more warmer and drier climate, right? So we have to think about species which will survive, the types of vegetation which will survive not only today, but tomorrow. That is number one. And number two, regarding the design, we really need some sort of policy intervention, I would say, to think about integration of the green and gray, like reusing of the stormwater, or like harvesting the stormwater so that they can be used, or the gray water which is coming from our showers, for example, or kitchens, can be channeled to the green spaces. Or we can think of some sort of engineering aspects, like changing the growth environment of the trees, using some sort of structural soil, we call it, with less density or less compaction, or structural cells. So this sort of design intervention is needed so that we can ensure that whatever we are planning for getting, so there is already some big projects going on, like 500,000 trees in the West. This is one of them. So there are some projects going on, but it is also important to understand that some poor quality urban parks or street trees will not serve the purpose in 20 years, 30 years time, unless we really take into these considerations.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess in this conversation too, there's a huge overlaying issue of planning and transport that we haven't gone to in our discussion of urban greening and plants. Yes, perhaps they could come together to solve some of those issues of those suburbs that do have a tough time commuting even in their daily life. Did anyone else want to add to that question?
Can I just mention just Greater Green, just flagging the project actually that James and Nigel, who are working on, like Bundap. Nigel, they're both adjunct professors at Sheffield University, and that was a sort of, my dad actually came from that town. It was a sort of very industrial, kind of grim up north city, and heavily bombed during World War II. And anyway, they have launched this program where they're doing verges, nature strips, and basically transformed a whole lot of the kind of hard surfaces in public space into sort of biodiverse green planting through the city. And it's been really transformative. But the kind of interesting thing about it, council's now just totally in love with it, because from a kind of cost and maintenance perspective, it's worked incredibly well in terms of having now permeable surfaces that enable water to be absorbed. So there's kind of the storm water is much more manageable in that area. It's been, it's actually, in terms of upkeep, you've got to have gardeners there, but it's actually not as expensive as maintaining hard surfaces and keeping that stone looking beautiful and clean. So, you know, from an economic point of view, when you look at the sort of whole benefits of it, it's worked much better, but it's also transformed the look of the city. Like, it's much more beautiful to be in. There's much more, you know, there's more fauna around in the forms of insects and birds and so on, but it's aesthetically much, much more pleasant as it kind of transforms its brand from being a kind of grim up north city to a vibrant university town, which it now is. And it's great to wander around, not in winter, but, you know, in summer, it's lovely. So, you know, I think that's really interesting too, that those kind of economic arguments and those sort of maintenance arguments, those holistic things, I don't think are fully understood or considered by most council areas in Australia. And I live in Brunswick, and, you know, we may think that Marybeck is one of the more progressive council areas, and it is, but we've been lobbying in our street for 6 years to cut up some of the asphalt and put verges so that we can start doing this sort of planning beyond the little bit around these trees that we have. And we just can't get it done because it's not a priority yet for council. So it's, you know, there's that kind of lobbying, and I think it's up to the people to rise up and, you know, fight for it, but we've got to understand what those benefits are and how to argue back to council to say, it's going to save you money, it's going to bring you benefits.
Excellent. Next question, please. Do we have one from the audience?
Any structural design of the green space to prevent the homeless / drug addict to occupy the green space at night?
Is that question targeted to a specific speaker or aspect of what we've talked about, or just generally?
Yes.
I can start if you like. So I've been working on a project where we're looking at working with communities about how to green their streets. So if we were to take out parking and increase the verges on their streets, like what do they want the vegetation to look like? How would they like it designed on our streets? And we were working with a street out in Springbank. And one of the concerns that came up was, if we increase the greenness on our street, if we increase the open space in our street, will it encourage homelessness? Will it encourage, they were really worried, particularly about things like having benches on it. And it's a tricky situation. One, of course, there's the safety issue, but there's also the equality issue there as well. And, you know, the right for people to have a space to sleep if needed. And so I know in the past, there's a lot of cities that, and I always forget the term of it, but that style of architecture that kind of prevents people from hanging around in that area.
It's crime prevention through environmental design.
Yeah, there we go. You know, there's been in some cities they don't put I think it was New York City, in one of their train stations, they stopped putting benches in and they started just putting these backrests in because they wanted to prevent people from potentially sleeping in that train station. I think when it comes to green space, I don't think it's so much about trying to design green space that's unfriendly to homelessness. I think it's more about tackling the homelessness itself and kind of supporting those people rather than trying to design unfriendly green space for particular people. So I wouldn't say that we should design our green space to kind of deter these people, but maybe we should be focusing more on how do we support these people to prevent them or provide them with a better situation than being in the park.
But in terms of safety, what is really important is around lighting design and making sure that you are considering design so that people can move through those public spaces at night. So we're doing a lot of work around, bringing in lighting that's less kind of glary, is a softer, broader light that enables you to see around corners and that kind of thing, so that you can walk through vegetation with a wide enough path, with enough understanding of what's ahead of you and behind you, through kind of more subtle lighting than what used to happen, to make sure that there is a really clear safety component in the design.
Yeah, maybe I can add a bit as well. So regarding the design aspects, it's from my side, from biophysical context, for example, it's very difficult to say, because it's not one size fits for all. Kind of, for example, in the street trees, apart from the issues of visibility or tram line to say, or the lights or the utility services, but there are also issues like, at the moment we have trees, and then if you look in the afternoon around 3 or 4 o'clock, there are a lot of undercuts of the sunshine, this radiation which is coming. So for the school going people, or the people who are coming back from work at the time, or they're exposed to huge radiation. So we cannot say that, planting trees will solve all the problems. But we have to think about how can we mix different types of species, to say, with different growth patterns, to say. Some grows very tall, some grows in medium height, so that they will prevent the incoming, the undercuts of the radiation. So this is very difficult to say that one general advice for design for all aspects. It should be site specific, it should be climate specific as well. So one solution in the west will not work in the east, to say, and because the street orientations are different, the surface materials are different. It needs to be site specific, it needs to be climate specific as well.
Yeah, and I guess you've got that issue too, that one of the best things you can do to make spaces safer is to activate them. And I think that speaks to some of your work, Ilan, as well.
Yeah, I think, and I agree with Mohammed that every site needs its own particular, intervention and design. But I do think activating spaces, we have a concept of eyes on the street, where people feel safe when they know that they are being watched, not in a surveillance way, but that there's a community around them, and that they're being cared for. So when you activate space, when people use it, and people that you know and trust use it, you feel safer, as a general rule of thumb. So that part of the story is, how do you create those spaces more active? It's about design. It's also about activities and organizing activities, having quite an active, proactive local government that runs activities. So it's not just about the physical space, but also the management over time.
Excellent. Jo, do we have another question online?
Yes, we've got a popular online question from Siobhan. How can green spaces be incorporated and preserved in the new activity centres with their projected increased density and building heights?
That is an excellent question. And I'll give the panel a hint. Black Bundup is a green roof. And that's been built on top of infrastructure, around infrastructure, and having to deal with that. Is that a viable alternative in these activity centres?
Yes. I'm a big fan of the activity centres. I mean, when we talk about access and we talk about livability, transport is absolutely critical to all of that. We talk about a city that's growing in population by 100,000 a year. Well, let's make sure that people live near public transport to be able to access that easily, to be able to move both into the city and across and around. And yes, I think, again, thinking about planting on artificial surfaces is really important. Planting on balconies, planting on roofs, planting on overpasses, all of those things, or under overpasses. It's really interesting. I was reading about a community who had been very unhappy about one of the sort of, where the railways are lifted up so that they're
The level crossing
what do you call the
removals,
level
yeah.
crossings?
Yeah.
Level crossings. And one community had really fought hard against the kind of massive aesthetic change to their suburb by having a huge high sort of overpass rather than a level crossing. But when it actually got delivered, compared to all the other places where it had been moved up high, and so the train was going over the top, and underneath suddenly there was all this new space to activate and plant and, you know, do your exercise in. The linear park that you were talking about before, suddenly that existed. And they were like, oh, we missed out. It was quite interesting. So I think it's about innovative approaches to green space and public space that exist in a kind of multi-layered environment.
Yeah, innovative and well done, I would add to that. But yeah, it is a challenge, but I think it's one we have to rise to. Would anyone else on the panel like to go with that one, or would like another question?
I guess.
Sorry, please go ahead.
I guess to me the question is never about the density of how many people live in the area, but is there a level of infrastructure equivalent to and sufficient for the level of population? And that would apply for high density activation centers and for, I guess, sprawling suburbs. They'll have the same problems if the infrastructure is not there. And that is green spaces, but it's also having a public library, it's also having schools, it's also having public transport, all those other infrastructures that make urban life livable and wonderful.
Mohammed?
Yeah, I think absolutely this is from physical environmental point of view also. There are spaces, let's say we call it straight canyon conditions, where we have high-rise buildings and then narrow streets. So in those particular areas, trees are not always the best option because they will reduce the wind and they will have not that much of the shade anyway because of the buildings and other benefits. So in a specific condition like the green walls, green roofs could be the best option to us to increase the cover of the greenness and increase the benefits. Yeah.
Marie, would you like a parting word? Because I've been given the 1 minute mark.
No, I guess I really agree with Katrina about like we need these innovative, we need to think outside the square, I think, the box, outside the box. When it comes to greening, particularly in these kind of active areas, where particularly you have a lot of transport infrastructure, but there's always a little bit of space, and there's always somewhere you can put a plant. You've just kind of got to think, I guess, a little bit outside the box about how do we do this and how do we turn it into something that people will want to use and people will appreciate.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And your parting remarks are all really great. So in the context of Burnley, it was always set up to research plans for what Melbourne was going to look like in the future. And it continues to do that as it turns 135 this year. So never has been a better time to be thinking about innovation with plants and how we can make our cities more livable. And if you could all thank our panellists together, so Professor Ilan Wiesel, Katrina Sedgwick, Dr. Marie Day, and Dr. Mohammed Rahman, thank you all.